The breaking point. The stars had never looked so cold to Captain Sarah Chen as they did through the cracked viewport of the diplomatic vessel Harmony's Edge. 3 months ago, she had been humanity's brightest hope for peaceful first contact with the Velthak Confederation. Now, she floated in the debris field that had once been the human colony of New Geneva, watching bodies drift past her damaged ship like grotesque satellites. The Velthak had made their position clear during that first meeting in the neutral zone. High Archon Zethmore, a towering figure with crystalline skin that reflected light like broken glass, had spoken in a voice that resonated through the translator with the authority of someone who had never been questioned. "Your species will submit to Confederation authority," he had declared, his 4 arms spread wide in what their xenobiologists later identified as a dominance display. "You will provide tribute, accept our oversight, and abandon your expansion beyond this system. This is not a negotiation." Sarah remembered her response, delivered with the diplomatic training that had taken her years to master. "Humanity appreciates the Confederation's offer of contact, but we maintain our right to self-determination. Perhaps we can find a mutually beneficial arrangement." The silence that followed had stretched for nearly a full minute. Then Zethmore had made a sound that the translator couldn't process, something between a laugh and the grinding of stone. "You mistake our generosity for weakness, primitive. We have conquered 700 worlds. We have ended civilizations that span star systems. What makes you believe you have the right to refuse us?" The negotiations had collapsed within hours. The Velthak delegation had departed with a final message. "You have 7 cycles to reconsider. After that, we will demonstrate why compliance is not optional." Sarah had reported back to Earth, recommending immediate military preparation while continuing diplomatic efforts. The Colonial Council had agreed, but their response had been measured, careful. They had allocated resources for defense, while authorizing Sarah to continue her mission, to find some way to bridge the gap between species. She had been en route to New Geneva to establish a forward diplomatic post when the Velthak had delivered their lesson. The attack had been swift and merciless. New Geneva's population of 2 million had been reduced to drifting corpses in less than 6 hours. The Velthak fleet had emerged from hyperspace without warning, their massive dreadnoughts casting shadows across the colony's 3 continents. They had targeted civilian infrastructure first, then methodically eliminated every settlement, every transport, every sign of human presence. Sarah's ship had been caught in the system's outer asteroid belt, her crew frantically working to repair hyperdrive components when the first reports came in. By the time they had managed to reach New Geneva's orbit, the planet was a tomb. Now, as Sarah stared at the carnage, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The diplomatic protocols she had memorized, the careful balance of give and take that had defined her career, all of it crumbled like sand. In its place, something harder crystallized, something that made her hands steady as she activated the emergency beacon that would carry her message across human space. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Diplomatic Corps," she began, her voice calm despite the devastation surrounding her. "New Geneva is gone. 2 million civilians dead. The Velthak Confederation has declared war on humanity by their actions, not their words. Diplomacy is dead. I am requesting immediate extraction and full mobilization of colonial defense forces." The response came 18 hours later, not from the Colonial Council, but from Admiral Marcus Webb, commander of the Earth Defense Fleet. His face on the communication screen was grim, aged by the weight of decisions Sarah could only imagine. "Captain Chen, you're ordered to rendezvous with the battle group at Kepler Station. We're forming a joint task force with the Colonial Defense Forces. Commander Victor Reeves will be your military liaison." Sarah had known Victor Reeves by reputation, a brilliant tactician who had earned his rank through innovative strategies rather than political connections. When she met him at Kepler Station, she understood why the Admiral had chosen him. His eyes held the same hardness she felt in her own chest, the same recognition that everything had changed. "My family was on New Geneva. Victor said without preamble as they stood before the tactical display in the station's war room. "My wife, my 2 daughters. They were visiting my sister-in-law. Thought they'd be safer there than on Titan with the mining strikes." Sarah watched him trace the orbital path of the planet that no longer existed as a habitable world. "I'm sorry for your loss, Commander." "Don't be sorry," Victor replied, his voice carrying the same calm Sarah had heard in her own transmission. "Be ready, because what we're about to do, it's going to change everything." The joint task force assembled over the next 6 weeks was unlike anything humanity had ever fielded. Ships from every colonial world, from the massive industrial platforms of Titan to the research stations of the outer system. But it wasn't the ships that impressed Sarah as she toured the fleet. It was the faces of the crews. The easy confidence of humanity's expansion era was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. These weren't explorers or miners or researchers pressed into military service. They were survivors who had seen what waited for them in the dark between stars, and they had chosen to meet it head-on. Dr. Elena Vasquez represented the best of human scientific ingenuity turned toward war. Her research team had spent the weeks since New Geneva analyzing every scrap of Velvac technology they could find, from the wreckage of their automated scouts to the energy signatures of their weapons. "They're powerful," she told Sarah and Victor during a briefing in her cramped laboratory aboard the research vessel Prometheus. "But they're also predictable. Their technology is advanced, but it's standardized across their entire fleet. They've been using the same basic designs for centuries." "Meaning?" Victor asked. "Meaning they've never faced an enemy that forced them to innovate," Elena replied, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from solving impossible problems. "They conquer through overwhelming force, not tactical superiority. They've never had to adapt." Sarah felt the first stirring of hope since New Geneva's destruction. "And humans? Humans are very good at adapting," Elena said with a smile that would have been terrifying to anyone who knew what she was planning. The Velvac Confederation had been the dominant power in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. Their empire stretched across 18 star systems, encompassing dozens of species that had learned to accept Velvac rule as a natural law. They had faced rebellions before, uprisings that flickered briefly before being crushed by the sheer mass of their military might. High Archon Zethmore had expected humanity's response to follow the same pattern. A few desperate strikes, some token resistance, then inevitable surrender as the reality of their situation became clear. The destruction of New Geneva had been intended as a demonstration, a clear message that submission was the only path to survival. He had not expected the message that reached the Confederation capital world of Vaithtar 3 months later, transmitted on frequencies that should have been impossible for human technology to access. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Human Resistance Coalition." The transmission began, the human female's face appearing on screens across the Confederation's command structure. "The Velvac Confederation has declared war on humanity through their actions at New Geneva. We accept that declaration." The transmission continued for exactly 60 seconds, each word delivered with the precision of a military report. But it was the final statement that sent ripples of unease through the Confederation hierarchy. "We do not seek your surrender. We do not offer negotiation. We will demonstrate why underestimating humanity was the last mistake your civilization will make." Admiral Krickstall, the Confederation's supreme military commander, dismissed the transmission as primitive bravado. The humans had perhaps a dozen warships, cobbled together from mining vessels and exploration craft. The Confederation could field 1,000 times that number. But as reports began filtering in from the frontier worlds, his certainty began to crack. The first strike came at the Jethvar system, a minor outpost on the edge of Velvac space. The attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the orbital defense platforms were slag, the administrative complex was a crater, and the 3,000 Velvac personnel stationed there were gone. The attackers had vanished before reinforcements could arrive, leaving behind only sensor ghosts and the growing realization that human technology was far more advanced than anyone had suspected. The second strike came 2 weeks later at a supply depot in the Morthac system, then a research station in the Outer Rim. Each attack was swift, precise, and seemingly impossible. The humans were striking across vast distances, their ships appearing and disappearing without detection. It was after the 7th attack that Admiral Crichstall began to understand what was happening. The humans weren't just fighting back, they were hunting. Each strike was more sophisticated than the last, each target chosen with surgical precision to maximize damage while minimizing Velthac's ability to respond. "They're learning," he told High Archon Zethmore during an emergency council session on Vethtar. "Each engagement teaches them more about our capabilities, our weaknesses." "Impossible," Zethmore replied, his crystalline features unchanged. "They are a primitive species. They lack the industrial capacity for sustained warfare." "Then explain how they've destroyed 18 installations in 6 weeks." Crichstall shot back. "Explain how they're striking targets that should be impossible to reach." The answer came in the form of Dr. Elena Vasquez's greatest achievement. Human scientists had spent months analyzing Velthac technology, but they had also been studying Velthac psychology, their patterns of behavior, their assumptions about warfare and conquest. The Velthac had built their empire on a foundation of overwhelming force and technological superiority. They had never faced an enemy that could match their firepower, so they had never learned to compensate for tactical disadvantage. Their fleet movements were predictable, their defensive strategies rigid, their response to unconventional attacks slow and confused. Humanity, by contrast, had spent its entire history fighting itself. Human military doctrine had been forged in the crucible of species-wide conflict, refined through centuries of warfare against enemies who shared their intelligence, their adaptability, their capacity for innovation. The Velthac had never fought humans before, but humans had been fighting Velthac-equivalent forces for millennia. They just hadn't known it. Commander Victor Reeves stood on the bridge of the battlecruiser Retribution, watching the tactical display as human strike groups moved through Velthac space like sharks through dark water. His ships were outnumbered 1,000 to 1, but numbers meant nothing when the enemy couldn't find you to fight you. "Target acquired," came the report from the navigation officer. "Velthac heavy cruiser, Morthac class. Estimated crew of 1,500. Weapons free," Victor ordered. "Make it count." The engagement lasted 4 minutes. The Velthac cruiser, designed to overwhelm enemy forces through superior firepower, never had a chance to bring its weapons to bear. Human ships struck from multiple vectors, their modified engines allowing them to change course and speed in ways that Velthac sensors couldn't track. When the cruiser's hull finally ruptured, spilling its crew into the void, Victor felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just the cold certainty that this was justice, measured in the same terms the Velthac had used at New Geneva. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Confederation. They're requesting a ceasefire." Victor smiled, the expression as cold as the space around them. "Tell them we'll consider their request once they've demonstrated they understand the gravity of their situation." "What would constitute such a demonstration, sir?" Victor's smile widened. "Complete evacuation of the Jethvar system. All Velthac forces, all civilian personnel, all infrastructure. They have 72 hours. The transmission went out across Velthac space, carried by the same infiltrated communications networks that had allowed humanity to strike with such devastating effect. The message was simple. Humanity would accept nothing less than total withdrawal from the contested systems. The Velthac response came within hours. High Archon Zethmore's image appeared on screens throughout human space, his crystalline features rigid with barely controlled fury. "The Confederation does not negotiate with primitives," he declared. "Your species will be extinct before you can threaten us again." Captain Sarah Chen watched the transmission from the bridge of her new flagship, the heavy cruiser Diplomatic Immunity. The name had been Victor's idea, a bitter joke that had become a rallying cry for the human fleet. "They still don't understand," she said to her tactical officer. "They think this is about negotiation." "Mom." Sarah turned to face the communications console. "Open a channel to all Valthak receivers. Let them hear this." The transmission began broadcasting across 18 star systems, reaching every Valthak world, every station, every ship. Sarah's voice carried across the void with the authority of someone who had tried diplomacy and learned its limitations. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Human Resistance Coalition. We have received the Confederation's response to our demonstration of resolve. We find it inadequate." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "The Valthak Confederation has chosen to interpret our actions as negotiation. This is incorrect. We are not negotiating. We are teaching. The lesson is simple. There are consequences for genocide. The classroom is the entire galaxy, and humanity has always been an excellent teacher." The transmission ended, leaving behind a silence that stretched across star systems. In the depths of space, human ships moved like shadows, their crews preparing for the next phase of a war that had already fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Valthak Confederation had ruled through fear for 3,000 years. Now, for the first time in their history, they were learning what it felt like to be afraid. The Reckoning. 6 months after the destruction of New Geneva, the Valthak Confederation discovered that fear was not merely an emotion, but a living thing that could spread through a civilization like a virus. It began in the Outer Rim territories, where human strike groups had been systematically dismantling Valthak infrastructure with surgical precision. Patrol ships would venture out on routine missions and simply never return. Supply convoys would vanish between star systems, leaving behind only scattered debris and the growing certainty that nowhere was safe. Admiral Crickstall stood in the command center of the Confederation's most heavily fortified battle station, watching sensor displays that showed exactly nothing. The humans had been operating in this sector for 3 weeks, and yet his most advanced detection arrays could find no trace of them. It was as if they had learned to move through space like ghosts, appearing only when they chose to strike. "Report," he ordered, his voice carrying the strain of too many sleepless cycles. 17 installations attacked in the past cycle alone. His aide replied, the young Valthak's carapace pale with stress. "Refineries, communication arrays, supply depots, all destroyed with minimal engagement time. Casualties, 43,000 dead, sir, and that's just confirmed losses. We've lost contact with 8 more facilities." Crickstall's forearms twitched involuntarily. In 6 months, the humans had inflicted more damage on the Confederation than the previous 3 major rebellions combined. But it wasn't just the material losses that concerned him. It was the way his officers looked at him now, the way their voices carried undertones of doubt when they received orders. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "priority transmission from the capital. High Archon Zethmore requests immediate conference." The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the Confederation's supreme leader in his private chambers. Zethmore's crystalline features, once perfect and unmarked, now showed stressed fractures around his eyes, tiny flaws that indicated the enormous pressure he was under. "Admiral," Zethmore began without preamble, "the Inner Council is demanding answers. The tributary species are beginning to question our strength. Some are even suggesting that humanity might be justified in their actions." Crickstall felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. "Justified, sir. The Threx Collective has withdrawn their military support. The Yorman Commonwealth is reconsidering their position. 3 minor species have declared neutrality in what they're calling the human conflict." Zethmore's voice carried a note of disbelief. "In 3,000 years, no one has ever declared neutrality when the Confederation was at war. What are your orders, sir?" "End this. Whatever it takes. Deploy the siege fleets. Use overwhelming force. Show the galaxy that the Confederation does not tolerate defiance." The transmission ended, leaving Krikstal alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that the war had already moved beyond conventional tactics. The humans weren't just fighting the Confederation military. They were attacking the very foundations of Valthak power. 3 star systems away, Commander Victor Reeves was discovering just how effective psychological warfare could be when properly applied. The human fleet had grown from a few dozen ships to over 200, reinforced by vessels from every human world and supplemented by an increasing number of alien defectors who had decided that humanity's cause was just. Intelligence report. Victor announced to his senior staff aboard the Retribution. The ship's war room had been expanded twice to accommodate the growing complexity of their operations. The Valthak are consolidating their fleets for a major offensive. They're pulling ships from 17 systems to form 3 siege groups. Their target? Asked Captain Sarah Chen, who had become Victor's closest advisor as the war evolved beyond its diplomatic origins. Her transformation from peacekeeping negotiator to military strategist had been remarkable to witness. Unknown, but intelligence suggests they're planning to strike at multiple human colonies simultaneously. Classic Valthak doctrine. Overwhelming force applied to civilian targets to break enemy morale. Dr. Elena Vasquez leaned forward from her position at the science station. They're still thinking in terms of their previous conquests. They expect us to behave like the species they've subjugated before. And we won't, Victor stated flatly. Because we've learned something they haven't. Fear works both ways. The plan that emerged from that meeting would later be studied by military historians as one of the most audacious operations in the history of interstellar warfare. Rather than defend against the Valthak siege fleets, the human forces would strike at the heart of the Confederation itself. The capital system, Sarah said as she studied the tactical projections. Vethtar, 20 billion Valthak civilians, the entire governmental structure, their most advanced shipyards. And the most heavily defended target in the galaxy, Victor added, which is exactly why they won't expect us to attack it. Elena's fingers danced across her console, bringing up detailed scans of the Vethtar system. The defenses are massive, but they're designed to repel conventional attacks. Massed fleets trying to fight their way through the outer defensive shells. They've never faced an infiltration strategy. Because no one has ever been insane enough to attempt one, Sarah pointed out. Insanity is relative, Victor replied with a smile that had become familiar to his officers. 6 months ago, they thought we were primitives. Now they're pulling fleets from across the galaxy to stop us. I'd say our reputation for insanity is becoming an asset. The operation began with a series of feints and false attacks that drew Valthak forces away from their capital system. Human ships appeared on the edges of multiple star systems, broadcasting loud enough to be detected, but fleeing before any serious engagement could occur. The Confederation fleets, conditioned by months of chasing shadows, began to spread out in pursuit of targets that always seemed to be just beyond their reach. While the Valthak military chased illusions, the real strike force moved through hyperspace using navigation techniques that Dr. Vasquez had developed from studying ancient human exploration methods. Instead of following the established hyperspace lanes that the Confederation monitored, the human ships traveled through unmapped regions of folded space, accepting the risks of navigation errors in exchange for complete stealth. Captain Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of her flagship as the human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Vethtar system. Before them lay the capital world of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for millennia, surrounded by defensive installations that could have destroyed conventional invasion fleets. All ships report ready, her tactical officer announced. Stealth systems are holding. We're invisible to their sensors. Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything they had worked for, everything they had sacrificed, had led to this point. The human species had been pushed to the edge of extinction, and they had chosen to push back. Signal the fleet, she ordered. Operation Checkmate is authorized. The attack began with surgical strikes against the system's communication arrays. Human ships, no larger than fighters but carrying weapons that could cripple stations, darted between the massive defensive platforms like minnows between sleeping whales. Within minutes, the Vathtar system was cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Phase 2 targeted the orbital shipyards, the massive industrial complexes that had been building Velthak warships for centuries. The humans didn't try to capture them. They simply erased them from existence, along with the half-built fleets that represented months of Confederation industrial capacity. By the time the Velthak defenders realized what was happening, the human fleet had already achieved its primary objectives. The capital system's defenses, designed to repel external attacks, were helpless against enemies that had already penetrated their perimeter. High Archon Zeth Mor watched his empire's heart burn from the windows of his palace complex. The orbital installations that had protected Vathtar for 1,000 years were dying, their massive hulks tumbling toward the planet's atmosphere like falling stars. The shipyards that had built the fleets that conquered the galaxy were gone, reduced to expanding clouds of debris. "How many?" he asked his aide, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entire outer defensive ring, sir. 73 installations. The orbital manufacturing complex. The fleet anchorage." The young Velthak's voice cracked with strain. "Conservative estimates suggest they've destroyed the equivalent of 800 major warships in less than 2 hours. Zeth Mor's reflection in the window showed stress fractures spreading across his crystalline features like a map of defeat. "And our losses?" "Unknown, sir. The humans are jamming all communications. We can't contact the outer system fleets." The truth was worse than Zeth Mor could have imagined. The human strike groups had identified and neutralized every major Velthak military asset in the system. The once mighty Confederation fleet was scattered, its ships either destroyed or fleeing toward the outer rim. The capital world itself was defenseless, its population looking up at skies filled with human ships. But the humans didn't bombard the planet. They didn't demand surrender. Instead, they did something far more devastating. They waited. The message that reached every screen, every communication device, every information network on Vathtar was simple and delivered in perfect Velthak. "Citizens of the Confederation," Captain Sarah Chen's voice carried across the homeworld of an empire. "Your leaders chose to begin this war by destroying human civilian populations. They believed that fear would make us surrender. They were wrong." The image shifted to show footage from New Geneva, the devastation that had started the war. Then it changed to show the current state of the Vathtar system, the burning wreckage of what had once been considered impregnable defenses. "We have demonstrated that no target is beyond our reach, that no force is sufficient to protect those who choose to make war on humanity. But we are not your leaders. We do not target civilians. We do not wage war on children." The transmission paused, allowing the implications to sink in across a world that had never known defeat. "This is the end of the Velthak Confederation as a galactic power. Your military is broken. Your fleets are scattered. Your ability to threaten other species is gone. What happens next is up to you." The final part of the message was addressed directly to the Confederation leadership. High Archon Zeth Mor, Admiral Crickstall, members of the Inner Council, you have 48 hours to surrender unconditionally and submit to trial for war crimes. After that, we will consider your continued existence an act of war against humanity. The transmission ended, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo across the galaxy. In the depths of his palace, Zeth Mor stared at the tactical displays that showed the complete destruction of his military power. The Confederation that had ruled for 3 millennia was gone, ended not by superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but by a species that had learned to fight with a precision and ruthlessness that no one had thought possible. "Sir," his aide spoke carefully, "the humans are maintaining position. They're not attacking, but they're not leaving either. They're waiting," Zeth Mor said quietly. "They know we have nowhere to go. What are your orders?" For the first time in his life, Zeth Mor had no answer. The Confederation had been built on the assumption that superior force would always prevail, that lesser species would always submit to greater power. But the humans had proven that assumption wrong. They had taken the worst that the Confederation could inflict and turned it into motivation for something far more dangerous than rebellion. They had turned it into justice. The surrender came 36 hours later. High Archon Zethmore, Admiral Crickstall, and the surviving members of the Inner Council were transferred to human custody aboard the diplomatic vessel that had once been called Harmony's Edge. The irony was not lost on Captain Sarah Chen, as she watched the beings who had ordered the destruction of New Geneva being led into the same detention cells that had once been prepared for human diplomatic staff. "What happens now?" Victor asked as they stood together on the observation deck, watching the Valthak homeworld slowly rotate beneath them.